So I wanted to make a quick video about pollinators, and I don't know why I've chosen a rather wet day in October to do this, um, but we do have some lovely verbena here, some lovely plants that our pollinators love, and at times over the year this has been covered in um, bees of all descriptions, and possibly some other pollinators too. So lots of people, when they think of pollinators, think of a honeybee. And I think lots of people have gone and actually started beekeeping because they had heard that pollinators were in trouble. But actually, one of the key things I wanted to get across here is the importance of biodiversity and of our native bees and other pollinators. So, um, there are about 250 species of bee in the UK and over 7,000 species of fly. And flies actually also do a great job pollinating. More about that in a minute. So you'll probably be most familiar with the hoverfly. Obviously, there are other insects such as butterflies. Um, there are beetles and all sorts of other pollinators that we have in the UK. And obviously, if you go overseas, then you could be talking about hummingbirds or bats as well. So here in the UK, we have um, some of the familiar insects and some of them perhaps less familiar. Um, and the important thing I wanted to say here is about biodiversity. So why is it important that we've got so many different species that are doing this pollination? Well, it's kind of horses for courses. In fact, it's very much horses for courses in that in different conditions and for different plants, you'll get different pollinators. So they've evolved together and they are really perfectly suited to one another. So you'll notice that our flowers come in all these different lovely shapes and sizes, and some of them are more accessible to, for instance, bees with short tongues, whereas others require a bee with a long tongue. And some of them actually need the flower to be shaken. So I believe that's the case with tomatoes. So we're actually dependent on bumblebees rather than honeybees to pollinate quite a lot of our food. And the fact that I'm doing this on a rather damp, fairly cold October day, um, and I sadly have no insect friends to illustrate this point. Um, One of the other things that these animals are adapted to are different conditions of temperature and shade. So bees tend to run very hot, so they like to keep their body temperature, I believe, at about 30 degrees Celsius, whereas flies can cope with much shadier conditions and colder conditions, and so you'll see the flies out pollinating on days where the bees are preferring to stay somewhere nice and warm. So there are a few things about this that are really important. One of them is that certain plants can be visited by lots of different species, and some of them by a much smaller range. And to be fair, some of the shorter tongued bees have managed to find a way around the those flowers that require a sort of longer tongue, in that they'll make a hole in the flower and kind of go in the side. But largely, all the different flowers have kind of different requirements, and so where some will be visited by lots of different species, some of them are really quite specialist. And when we're thinking about our lovely butterflies and things, actually, and not just the plants that they're pollinating, but also the food plant for caterpillars. Some of those can be really very specific, that they're not eating lots of different kinds of plants, or they're not going to lots of different flowers. They have kind of favourites. So this is One of the key points about biodiversity is that by having lots of different species that are able to do the same job, it means that there's more resilience. So the flower is more likely to get pollinated if it turns out that it's quite a cold year or quite a wet year, or for whatever reason, or if a disease was to break out in the bees, which is a reason we need good beekeepers who are making sure that honeybees aren't carrying and passing on diseases. They'll be very vigilant about this, and the same thing, sort of cleaning out our bee hotels and what have you each year. But that aside, the point about biodiversity is that because we've got lots of different routes to achieving the same thing, that is, lots of different species who are coming and visiting these flowers, it means that there's more chance that both the flower and the insects will survive if there's, a particularly, quote, bad year in terms of the conditions, but also if there's a diversity of flowers, it means that if one particular type of flower is not doing very well in a given year, hopefully there are other food sources that they can go to. Otherwise, a bad year could be really catastrophic. So it is a bit of a problem for these species that are sort of specialists, that have a very sort of narrow relationship, that they're really sort of not visiting lots of different plants, not food plants, not lots of different plants. It's one, because if things happen that threaten that particular plant, it threatens the butterfly, or whatever the animal is that's dependent on it. So what do I hope you'll take from this? Well, that it's not just honeybees that do pollination, that biodiversity really matters, that it's really important to have a whole variety of species that are slightly different, doing different things, so they're not kind of occupying exactly the same niches. There's overlap, but they're also like the flies in the colder temperatures and the bees in the warmer temperatures, that they're not doing exactly the same thing, but there is overlap between them. And I hope you've also learned a little bit about the importance of supporting pollinators and just invertebrates in general, by having lots of lovely, diverse plants, especially native plants, which they're really have adapted, they've evolved with, and are adapted to in your wild space, in your garden spaces.